Welcome back to another session recording of CELTA Trainer and Training. So we're at week 11. Again, we had the same setup this week as we did last week because we had one input session on Tuesday morning, and then the second half of the input session was tutorial meetings for tutorial 2. And then on Thursday, we had non-assessed TPs because if you remember from last week, the candidates had switched over from elementary and intermediate, so they switched groups. So they're teaching one non-assessed TP to kind of get the feel of the students. So the input session on Tuesday morning was the lexical approach. So the tutor went through the session all about lexical approach obviously from Michael Lewis, if you don't know. And some of the teachers had not heard of this. So they started with a true and false kind of shared document type of activity where they looked through some descriptions, criteria, talking points, I guess, and they tried to determine whether they were true or false according to the lexical approach and why, and they gave some justification. I was surprised that some of them hadn't heard of it, especially because of this group, this specific group, they all are teachers that have had at least a couple years of experience, if not more. So I was surprised that there wasn't more awareness around it. But, you know, sometimes it happens depending on where you're teaching and your exposure. So so they went through with no problems. They weren't able to interpret the statements, or they had, I'm not going to say that they weren't able to, that they had some difficulties interpreting some of the statements regarding the lexical approach. One of them specifically was, hold on, let me pull it up here. Language is seen as an abstract idealization. So that was one that they got real stuck on. And there was some comparison to the communicative approach. And it was interesting to hear because one of the candidates had made a comment that the communicative approach, the main goal is just for communication, and it doesn't matter the accuracy of the message. It's just that you're speaking and you're getting your message across. And that also, I feel as if is a very big overgeneralization. So anybody interested in taking these types of courses, and especially if you haven't had much exposure in terms of approaches and methodologies throughout the years, it would be interesting. It's not necessary, but it would be quite interesting for people to start looking into those things so they have a general understanding of kind of where things came from. Anyways, it's, again, not a requirement for CELTA, but just kind of a recommendation for teachers in general. Like we hear the title, the communicative approach, and we make assumptions about it, and then I think they become very much overgeneralizations and are not entirely accurate. So we have to be careful of doing that. Okay, so anyways, back to the training. Get off my soapbox. I'll go back to the training. So so then they had, again, like I said, they had some bias and maybe some were lacking in some of the conceptual ideas, but okay, overall, they were able to clarify everything. Then as a group, they went through some sentences, and one of the teachers actually asked for clarification because she didn't know what Lexis was. Which again, I was surprised, not because the expectation is for people in a CELTA to know what Lexis is and how to be able to define. Obviously, they're taking a CELTA to be able to get that basic knowledge, but I was surprised because these are questions that I wouldn't have expected necessarily from a group of teachers that has the number of years of experience that this group does. So yeah, it was, just being reflective here, not criticizing it, just I wasn't expecting some of the questions that were coming up, and I wasn't expecting some of the ideas and the train of thoughts in some of the conversations. So again, just interesting points, no judgment. Then the tutor went through what is a lexical chunk, what can we consider to be lexical chunks, went through things like phrasal verbs and idioms, collocations, adjacency pairs, discourse markers, sentence frames, things like that. Interesting thing is that, and I see this beyond the CELTA too, not referring only to this group, that those things, those identifiers, I guess say, like idioms and collocations, people are either confusing them or misusing them. So probably would need a little bit of clarification too. So if you're thinking about taking CELTA or something like that, again, not necessary to prepare for the CELTA, because the CELTA is the initial training course. But if you're thinking of it, or if you're thinking of, starting to do your teacher training, invest some time, terminology is quite important, and clarification of terminology would be a recommendation. So there was some input about lexical chunk examples. They were matching terminology with examples. We went through a couple different perspectives from Michael Lewis to Thornberry, blah, blah, blah. Some references there. And then we went into how to put the pedagogical cycle into practice. So there was the pedagogical cycle consisting of observing, hypothesizing, and experimenting. And so talked about how to put that into practice. They went to breakout rooms, and they were tasked to read a few paragraphs of a text and identified lexical chunks that would be useful for their students. And then in the whole group looked back at that. And then there was some sharing of resources. And to wrap up the session, the tutor gave lots of practical tips and tools that the teachers could use to implement the lexical approach in their own lessons. So that was quite nice. The second half of that morning, on Tuesday morning, was, again, like I said, the tutorial 2, but with the teachers who didn't receive it the previous week. And I was able to watch the other tutor go through the process of giving a tutorial 2 and going through the individual list, like I showed in the video last week of the CELTA 5, the candidate handbook, and the record keeping there. It was similar to what I had seen with the main course tutor, talking about the different points. Again, I think with this group, with the 2 people that I observed, they also had different interpretations. They were marking themselves in their CELTA 5 as not to standard, standard, and above standard, based on their efforts and not based on the course expectations. So again, a little bit of misinterpretation on how they're assessing themselves. CELTA is good because it does give these candidates a chance to be a little bit of self-reflective, I should say, to be self-reflective and to take some time to think about some very concrete criteria on what they're doing and what they're producing. It would be useful and beneficial for them to look at these criteria before and after their teaching practice, because this is the criteria that the tutors use in terms of observation and assessing their progress. So I think the more you look at the criteria, the more that you're really honest with yourself. I mean, truly honest based on evidence, not just your feelings, based on what you're doing, what you're producing, would be helpful. Because remember, in these types of courses, tutors can only assess what is on your what you give them, like for example, what's on your assignments, what is written down on your lesson plans. This is what we can assess. We can assess the concrete things that happen in class, because we need evidence of this. So we need to prove that if we say you're meeting the standards or you're above standards, we have to have an example of that. And we have to have a clearly stated example. This is what happened. And so this is evidence that this is happening to standard, above standard, not to standard. So yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting for teachers to go back to that and to start looking at that a little bit more. And then there was the Nonassess TP. So actually, let me open up here because I think I have some notes. Had some notes. I don't know where my notes went. Anyways, okay, so there was two teachers that taught for the Nonassess TP, and their lessons were fine. There was no major issues. They're getting to know the students a little bit, but also I would, if you're doing Nonassess TPs, here's my recommendation. If you're not doing the intensive course, because I think CELTA intensive, you don't have time for non-assessed TPs. I think maybe your first one is not assessed, but then after that you're being assessed. If you're doing it part-time and you have the chance to give non-assessed TPs, my recommendation is, especially since the two people teaching had tutorials, they had their tutorial too, they have a list of action points, and you have action points after your tutorial 1, 2. So you're constantly being given some action points, things that you need to work on. One thing that I did notice, one of the candidates, I noticed that she is trying to find her balance in terms of instructions. So it was too much, and then it was too little, a little too blunt, and then she struck a decent balance in this non-assessed TP. So good on her for taking advantage of teaching a lesson that it's practice, in theory it's a practice, and addressing some of the action points that her tutors had given her. So I think that sometimes we get very, very worked up about, everything has to be perfect in a lesson. No, CELTAs, we're looking for progress. And so if you have 2 or 3 action points from your tutorial 2s, from your lesson feedbacks, from your, all of that, the observation forms and things like that, I think what people should be doing, this would be my recommendation, and say, okay, I have 2 or 3 things to work on. This is what I'm going to focus on. So the rest of the lesson, I'm going to continue doing how I prepare it, but I'm going to take these 2 considerations, and these are the things that I'm focusing on for this lesson. And because you're not being assessed, even better. So if the lesson is a flop, it's okay. Technically, it's okay because that's fine, because you were able to practice what you needed to practice. So yeah, take advantage if you're doing part-time and you have non-assessed teaching practice. Work on the action points, or things that you've been talking about or haven't been able to master 100% in your previous teaching practice. I would say that that's it. There was some informal feedback afterwards, obviously, and then some assisted lesson planning. And yeah, the candidates are doing okay. They're starting to get the hang of it a bit. There's less, I would say, less anxiety, and they're starting to make a little bit better contributions in terms of considerations and helping each other out a little bit more. And I would say the more that you help your peers when you're doing assisted lesson planning, the better it's going to be for you, because you have to justify things from your perspective. And sometimes it gets you into a discussion with a peer that is very beneficial and informative of maybe a different way of doing things. So take advantage of working in groups, because that's something that people don't really get to have very frequently, is that help while they're planning their lessons. So that was week 11. A little bit of a different week, but next week it should be going back to normal in terms of input sessions, and we'll still have non-assessed TPs, but it'll be 2 input sessions and full lessons on Thursdays. So I'll be back next week. Take care.